Robert Mitchell never expected much excitement at age 68. Each morning, he walked his dog, read his paper, and watched life pass by from his front porch in Cedar Grove. But on this ordinary Tuesday evening, smoke caught his eye from the apartment building across the street. Without thinking, he grabbed his neighbor's ladder and ran toward the building. As flames lit up the night sky, Robert climbed through the smoke, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. He didn't know the woman he was about to save was Margaret Thompson, the same Margaret he'd loved in the summer of 1973, the one who moved away without saying goodbye. Some loves never fade, some memories stay sharp, and sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The vintage Farberware percolator gurgled its familiar morning song as Robert Mitchell adjusted his tortoiseshell reading glasses. Dawn light filtered through his kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He'd used this same coffee pot for 43 years, a wedding gift from his late wife, Susan. Even after newer, fancier coffee makers appeared in department stores, Robert kept this one, finding comfort in its reliable rhythm. Max, his 10-year-old golden retriever, sat patiently by the back door, tail thumping against the floor. The morning walk was as much a part of their routine as the coffee itself. Robert glanced at the clock. 6:45 a.m., right on schedule. "Ready for our walk, old friend?" Robert's voice carried the gentle rasp of age, but retained its warmth. Max's tail wagged faster in response. The Cedar Grove morning air held the crisp promise of early autumn. Robert pulled his cardigan closer, another habit Susan had teased him about, calling him her distinguished professor, even though he'd spent his career teaching high school chemistry. The memory brought a slight smile to his weathered face. Their route never varied, down Maple Street, past the Petersons' meticulously maintained roses, around the corner where old Mrs. Henderson always waved from her window, and finally to the small park where Max could chase squirrels that never seemed to learn their lesson. The familiarity was comforting, like the coffee percolator's burble or the weight of the morning paper tucked under his arm. "Morning, Robert," called Sarah Chen from her driveway. The young pediatrician had moved in 6 months ago, bringing a splash of youth to their aging neighborhood. "Max looks spry today. He's got his eye on those squirrels again," Robert replied, pausing to chat. These brief interactions peppered his morning walks, small reminders that even in retirement, he remained part of the community's fabric. Back home, Robert settled into his porch chair. Max sprawled contentedly at his feet. The paper crinkled as he unfolded it, his fingers automatically finding the crossword puzzle. Susan had always tackled the crossword first, pencil poised like a conductor's baton. Robert preferred the blue pen in his breast pocket. "Living dangerously," Susan would have said with a wink. The morning passed in its usual peaceful rhythm. Robert watered his tomato plants, struggling this year, sorted through mail, mostly advertisements, and listened to the local news radio. Another car break-in on Oak Street. Yet something felt different today. Perhaps it was the way the light caught his wedding photo on the mantel, or how the coffee tasted slightly more bitter than usual. His thoughts drifted, as they sometimes did, to another autumn morning decades ago. Before Susan, before his teaching career, there had been Margaret Thompson. They were barely 18, full of dreams and certainties that only youth could sustain. He remembered her laugh, how it seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep and joyful, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. The memory faded as Max nudged his hand, requesting attention. Robert scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for the anchor to the present moment. "Just wool gathering, boy," he murmured. "Ancient history now." His neighbor Tom's voice carried across the yard, discussing fall fertilizer with his wife. Children's laughter echoed from the direction of the elementary school. A delivery truck rumbled past. Life in Cedar Grove flowed on, predictable as the coffee percolator's morning ritual. Robert checked his watch, another habit Susan had tried to break him of. "Nearly time for lunch, Max," he announced. The dog's ears perked up at the word. Some routines were sacred to them both. Inside, he washed his coffee cup, dried it carefully, and placed it back in its designated spot. The percolator sat cooling. On the counter, its chrome surface reflecting the kitchen in distorted miniature. Such a simple thing, yet it had witnessed so many mornings, so many quiet moments of reflection. "What do you say to a sandwich, old friend?" Robert asked Max. The dog's tail provided an enthusiastic answer. As he assembled their lunch, turkey on wheat for himself, a dental treat for Max, Robert hummed an old tune. He couldn't remember where he'd learned it, but it felt right for this peaceful moment in his orderly world. Little did he know that, by evening, this carefully maintained routine would be thoroughly and irrevocably disrupted, and that old tune would suddenly have a name again. Moon River, Margaret's favorite song from that long-ago autumn. The first sign was Max's restlessness. The dog lifted his head from his evening nap, ears twitching, nose working the air. Robert had just settled into his evening ritual, reading glasses perched on his nose, crime novel open on his lap, when he noticed the change in his companion's behavior. "What is it, boy?" he asked, marking his page with a leather bookmark Susan had given him years ago. Max whined, padding to the front window. That's when Robert saw it, a thin tendril of smoke rising from the apartment building across the street. The Cedars was an older three-story complex, mostly occupied by retirees and young professionals. In the gathering dusk, the smoke looked almost beautiful, like ink spreading through water. Then he saw the orange flicker behind a third-floor window. Robert moved with a speed that surprised even himself, muscle memory from decades of managing. High school lab accidents taking over. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and spoke clearly despite his racing heart. "Fire at the Cedars, 1242 Oak Street, 3rd floor, west side." His voice remained steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he set the phone down. Through his window he could see other neighbors emerging from their homes, faces upturned. In concern, Sarah Chen was already on her phone, presumably also calling emergency services. But what caught Robert's attention was Tom's aluminum extension ladder propped against the garage, where he'd been cleaning gutters that afternoon. The ladder, the 3rd floor. His mind made calculations he hadn't attempted since his teaching. Days, measuring angles and distances with the precision that had once impressed his students. Max barked, a sharp sound that seemed to cut through Robert's hesitation. Smoke was now pouring from the window, and he could hear distant sirens, but they sounded too far away. "Stay, Max," he commanded, voice firm despite his racing heart. The dog whined, but obeyed as Robert hurried outside. Tom was already moving toward his ladder. "Robert, what are you—" "Help me with this," Robert interrupted, surprising himself. With his decisiveness, together they lifted the ladder, its aluminum length catching the last rays of sunlight. More neighbors had gathered now. Robert heard scattered phrases, "Fire department's coming," and "at least 10 minutes out," and "someone's still up there." The smoke had thickened, and Robert could feel heat radiating from the building even at this distance. His hands gripped the ladder's cool metal as he and Tom positioned it beneath the 3rd-floor window. Simple machines, he thought absurdly, remembering teaching that physics lesson. Levers and pulleys and the angles of ladders against burning buildings. "Robert, you can't—" Tom started, but Robert was already climbing. The aluminum rungs felt solid under his feet, each step accompanied by the creaking of metal adjusting to his weight. His cardigan, the same one he'd worn on his morning walk, fluttered in the hot updraft from the fire. Somewhere below, he heard Sarah Chen shouting something about waiting for the firefighters, but there wasn't time to wait. Through the smoke, he could see movement in the window. A figure struggling with the latch. His muscles protested as he climbed higher, his breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with fear. Not fear for himself, he realized with mild surprise. Fear for whoever was trapped up there, fear of being too late, fear of failing when it mattered most. The smoke thickened as he neared the third floor. Heat pressed against him like a physical wall, and his eyes began to water. Through the tears and smoke, he saw the window finally open, and a figure appeared, a woman coughing violently, her grey hair tinged orange by the flames behind her. "Here!" Robert called, his voice stronger than he felt. "Take my hand!" She reached out, and as their fingers touched, something electric shot through Robert's spine, a recognition so profound it nearly made him lose his grip on the ladder. Even through the smoke and tears and years, he knew those hands. The small scar on the thumb from a long-ago cooking accident, the slight bend in the ring finger that never quite healed right after a softball game. Details he'd forgotten he remembered slammed into his consciousness with the force of the heat. At his back. "Margaret!" he whispered, but the roar of the fire swallowed the name. There was no time for memory or shock or the thousand questions suddenly crowding his mind. The flames were spreading, and the ladder trembled beneath them. With strength he didn't know he still possessed, Robert helped Margaret onto the ladder. Beside him, "Hold tight," he instructed, his teacher's voice automatically emerging in crisis. "We'll go down together." The descent was a blur of smoke and tension and careful steps. Robert's world narrowed to the rungs beneath his feet and the presence beside him, each movement measured and deliberate. He could hear sirens getting closer, shouts from below growing clearer. When their feet finally touched solid ground, Robert's legs nearly gave out. Hands reached for them, neighbors helping them away from the building, someone draping blankets over their shoulders, voices asking if they were all right. Through it all, Robert couldn't take his eyes off Margaret's face. Age had left its marks, just as it had on him, but underneath was the same girl who'd shared his dreams one autumn long ago. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and in her smoke-reddened eyes he saw the same recognition that had nearly stopped his heart on the ladder. "Robert Mitchell," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke, but carrying the echo of that bubbling laugh he'd remembered just that morning. "Still coming to my rescue." Then she coughed violently, and paramedics were there, leading her to a waiting ambulance. Robert stood rooted to the spot, the aluminum ladder behind him still leaning against the burning building like an exclamation point at the end of an unfinished sentence. Max's bark cut through his daze. The dog had broken free from the house and bounded across the street, pressing against Robert's legs as if to ensure his human had returned safely. "I'm okay, boy," Robert murmured, his hand finding the dog's familiar fur. But as he watched the ambulance doors close on Margaret's face, he wondered if that was entirely true. His orderly world had just tilted on its axis, and he had a feeling things would never be quite the same again. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos. Robert sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing his smoke-scented cardigan, while Max lay at his feet. The dog had refused to leave his side, and somehow, perhaps due to the general confusion or Sarah Chen's quick thinking in identifying him as a therapy dog, he'd been allowed to stay. A nurse had already checked Robert over, declaring him remarkably unscathed, except for some mild smoke inhalation. "Lucky," she'd said, though Robert wasn't sure if she meant his lack of injuries or something else entirely. His hands wouldn't stop trembling, not from fear or exhaustion, though both were certainly present, but from the lingering shock of recognition. Margaret Thompson. After all these years, something fell from his pocket as he shifted in his chair. A photograph, edges singed and curling. He picked it up carefully, and his breath caught. Two young faces smiled up at him, a boy and girl at a county fair, cotton candy held between them like a sweet cloud. The date stamp in the corner read, August 1973. "You dropped something earlier," came a voice from behind him. "When you were helping me down the ladder, I asked the nurse to retrieve it." Robert turned. Margaret stood there in a borrowed hospital gown, her grey hair messy from being hastily cleaned of smoke, her face bearing the same mix of uncertainty and recognition he felt in his own heart. "Margaret," he said, and just speaking her name aloud made it all real. Should you be up?" They checked me over. Smoke inhalation. Minor burns on my hands. Nothing too serious, thanks to you. She gestured to the chair beside him. May I? Max lifted his head as Margaret sat down, studying her with gentle brown eyes, before offering his paw. She laughed. That same bubbling sound Robert had remembered just that morning, and shook it. You always did love dogs, Robert said softly. And you always did rush in to help without thinking of yourself. Her voice held warmth and something else. Regret, perhaps. Some things don't change. They sat in silence for a moment, the photograph between them like a bridge across 50 years. In the background, hospital sounds continued, phones ringing, nurses calling, wheels squeaking on linoleum floors. I've lived in the Cedars for 3 months, Margaret said finally. I never knew you were just across the street. I've been in that house for 40 years. Robert's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. Susan, my wife, she loved the bay window in the living room. Susan? Margaret nodded. I heard about her passing. 5 years ago? 6, Robert corrected gently. Cancer. Another silence, more comfortable than the last. I'm sorry I never reached out, Margaret said. When I moved back to Cedar Grove, I saw your name in the local paper once. Something about retiring from teaching. But it felt complicated. Robert understood complicated. He thought of all the times he'd started to look her up over the years, especially after Susan died, only to stop himself. Some doors, once closed, seemed better left that way, except now here they were, thrown, together by fate and fire, with a singed photograph and a lifetime of questions between them. A doctor approached, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Thompson? We'd like to keep you overnight for observation. Of course, Margaret said, but her eyes stayed on Robert. Will you? She hesitated. Will you come back tomorrow? There's so much to talk about. Robert looked at the photograph in his hands, at Max's trusting face, at Margaret's questioning eyes. Sometimes life offered second chances in the strangest ways. I'll bring you a decent cup of coffee, he promised. Hospital coffee is still terrible, I assume. Some things really don't change, she smiled, standing carefully. Then impulsively she squeezed his hand. Thank you, Robert. Not just for today, but for being exactly who I remembered. As she followed the doctor down the hall, Robert sat back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Max rested his head on Robert's knee, offering silent comfort. Quite a day, old friend, Robert murmured, scratching the dog's ears. The photograph lay in his lap, 2 young faces frozen in a moment of perfect happiness, unaware of the long road that would lead them back to each other. Outside the hospital windows, night had fallen completely. Somewhere across town, firefighters were still dousing the last embers at the Cedars. And here, in this quiet corner of the emergency room, Robert Mitchell felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the fluttering, uncertain, wonderful feeling of a new beginning. Morning arrived with the soft whisper of rubber-soled shoes on hospital floors and the distant chime of elevator doors. Robert had gone home briefly to change and feed Max, but found himself returning to the hospital well before visiting hours officially began. The vintage percolator had made 2 cups of coffee, carefully poured into a thermos that had seen better days. At the nurse's station, he found an ally in Maria, the night nurse transitioning to day shift. Mrs. Thompson's been asking about you, she said with a knowing smile, glancing at his visitor's badge. Room 412. The hospital corridor stretched before him, its walls painted in that peculiar shade of institutional beige that seemed universal to all medical facilities. His footsteps echoed as he walked, each step accompanied by the gentle sloshing of coffee in the thermos. Margaret was awake, sitting up in bed and looking out her window at the rising sun. The hospital gown had been replaced with comfortable pajamas. Someone must have brought them from her apartment. She turned at his approach, and her face lit up in a way that made Robert's heart skip. You really did come back, she said. I promised coffee. He held up the thermos. And I always keep my promises. The unspoken weight of those words hung between them for a moment before Margaret smiled. Most of them, anyway. As Robert poured coffee into 2 paper cups, Margaret adjusted her position, wincing slightly. The burns on her hands were bandaged, but her movements were careful, deliberate. "The doctor says I can leave this afternoon," she said, accepting the coffee with both hands. "Though I'm not sure where I'll go. The fire marshal said it'll be weeks before the Cedars is habitable again." "You could," Robert started, then stopped himself. Was it too soon? Too forward? But Margaret was looking at him expectantly, so he continued. "I have a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but—" "Robert Mitchell," she said, that familiar laugh bubbling up. "Are you inviting me to stay with you? Well, Max would be disappointed if he didn't get to see you again," Robert deflected, though they both knew it was more than that. Margaret took a sip of coffee, her eyes closing in appreciation. "You still make it the same way. Strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough to enjoy. Susan used to say I should have been a barista instead of a chemistry teacher." "Chemistry?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Not physics. Life takes unexpected turns." Robert settled into the visitor's chair. "Speaking of which, what brought you back to Cedar Grove?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee cup as if reading. "The answer there, David, my husband, passed away last year. Cancer, like your Susan. Our daughter Claire lives in the city and I wanted to be closer to her. And maybe," she looked up, meeting his eyes, "maybe part of me wanted to come home. Cedar Grove's changed a lot since 1973. Some things haven't changed at all." Her gaze was steady. "You still rush into burning buildings to save damsels in distress. That was just the one time. In 73, I mean." Robert smiled at the memory. "When your dad's shed caught fire. And you came running with the garden hose." Margaret laughed. "Dad was so impressed. He finally approved of you taking me to the county fair, where this was taken." Robert pulled out the singed photograph, now carefully stored in a plastic sleeve he'd found in his desk drawer. "I've been wondering, how did you have this?" Margaret's fingers traced the plastic over their younger selves. "I kept a box, letters, photos, ticket stubs, silly things that seemed important at the time. When I moved back, I found I couldn't quite let them go." The morning sun had fully risen now, painting the room in warm light. Outside, the hospital was coming to life. Voices in the corridor, the rattle of breakfast carts, the distant ding of elevators. "I looked for you," Robert said quietly. "After you left, your parents wouldn't tell me anything. They thought they were protecting me, protecting both of us, really." Margaret set her coffee down. "I was 17, pregnant, and terrified. They sent me to live with my aunt in California." Robert's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "You were—" "I never knew. I lost the baby in my 4th month." Her voice was gentle, remembering an old pain. "By then, everything had changed. You'd started college, and I was too ashamed to come back." "Margaret," Robert reached for her hand, careful of the bandages. "You should have told me. I would have been noble, sacrificed your dreams, married me out of duty." She squeezed his fingers. "That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. You were meant for more than a shotgun wedding in Cedar Grove." They sat, in silence, hands linked, as the morning bustle of the hospital continued around them. 50 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens settled between them like dust motes in the sunlight. Finally, Robert spoke. "The spare room has a nice view of the garden. Max likes to sun himself there in the afternoons." Margaret smiled, understanding all he wasn't saying. "I'd like that. Though I should warn you, I'm a much better cook now than I was at 17. "Good, because I still can't cook anything more complicated than toast." Their laughter mingled with the hospital sounds, a new note in an old symphony. Through the window, Cedar Grove was waking up to another autumn day, unaware that in room Yas 412, time was bending back on itself, offering second chances to those patient enough to wait for them. The spare room key turned smoothly in the lock. Though Robert couldn't remember the last time he'd opened this door, the room had become a repository of sorts. Boxes of Susan's things he hadn't been able to part with, old textbooks from his teaching days, photo albums he rarely looked at anymore. "I'll clear all this out," he said quickly, watching Margaret take in the cluttered space. "It'll just take a few hours to—" "Is that my letter?" Margaret's voice was soft, wondering. She moved to the dresser where a pale blue envelope lay. Atop a stack of papers, its edges yellowed with age. Robert felt heat rise to his face. "I forgot that was there. I should have—" But Margaret was already lifting the envelope with trembling fingers. Her own handwriting, 50 years younger, spelled out Robert Mitchell in careful cursive. "You kept it all this time?" "I never opened it." Robert stayed by the door, giving her space. "It came 2 months after you left. By then I was angry, I suppose, hurt. I promised myself I'd return it unopened. But you didn't." She turned the envelope over, studying the unbroken seal. "No, I didn't." Max padded into the room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. He settled between them like a furry mediator, tail sweeping the floor in slow arcs. "Would you like to know what it says?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Robert moved to the window, looking out at his small garden where the tomatoes were still struggling. "After 50 years, does it matter anymore?" "Maybe that's exactly why it matters." The sound of tearing paper made him turn. Margaret had opened the envelope, her hands steady now. "Dear Robert," she began reading, "by the time you get this, you'll have started college. I hope you're doing well in your classes. I know you'll be brilliant. You always were." Her voice carried them back through decades, to a time when their worlds had been smaller, but their dreams infinite. The letter spoke of fear and shame, of love and regret, of a baby that would never be, and a future that slipped away like sand through their fingers. "I never sent another letter," Margaret said when she finished reading. "I wrote dozens, but they're all in that box that survived the fire, all except this one. Life has a strange way of coming full circle." Robert sat on the edge of the bed, careful to leave space between them. "I spent years wondering what this letter said, imagining every possibility, and now, we're here." Margaret carefully folded the letter and held it out to him. Older, hopefully wiser, brought together by another fire. Robert took the letter, their fingers brushing. "I'll help you get this room sorted," he said, changing the subject before emotion could overwhelm him. "The closet's empty, and there's a chest of drawers under all these boxes somewhere." "Robert!" Margaret's voice stopped him as he stood. "Thank you, not just for the room, but for keeping the letter, for being someone who would keep it for 50 years. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Max got up and followed him to the door, then seemed to change his mind and went back, to lay his head on Margaret's knee. "Traitor," Robert said fondly. "He knows a soft touch when he sees one." Margaret scratched behind Max's ears. "I always wanted a dog, but David was allergic. Funny, the small compromises we make in life." Robert leaned against the doorframe. "Susan was allergic to cats. I used to joke that's why she married me. I came with no pets attached." They shared a smile, acknowledging how easy it was to talk about their late spouses, how the memories brought comfort rather than pain. "I'll start clearing these boxes," Robert said. "Maybe we can sort through them together. There might be other memories worth finding." "I'd like that." Margaret was already opening another box, ever curious. "Oh, is this your old chemistry lab coat?" Robert groaned. "The one with the burn hole from the sodium experiment? I can't believe I kept that." "The famous experiment that got you banned from using open flames for a month?" Her eyes sparkled with remembered mischief. "As I recall, that was the same month we had our first kiss, behind the equipment shed. Because it was the only place I could sneak a cigarette without getting caught." Robert shook his head. "I was quite the rebel. You were perfect." Margaret's voice held no regret, just warm remembrance. "And look at us now, still playing with fire." The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the air. Outside, the world went about its business. But in this room, time moved differently, weaving past and present into something new and precious and possibly lasting. Max's tail thumped against the floor, keeping time with their shared laughter as they began the task of making space, in the room and in their lives, for whatever might come next. The call came while Robert was making his morning coffee. His son Michael's name flashed on the phone screen, accompanied by a photo of a grinning 30-something man who shared Robert's jawline and Susan's eyes. "Dad, are you okay? I just saw the news online. Local senior citizen heroically rescues woman from apartment fire. That's you, isn't it?" Robert adjusted his reading glasses, suddenly aware that he hadn't actually planned how to explain this situation to his family. "I'm fine, Michael. It wasn't as dramatic as the news makes it sound." "Not dramatic? Dad, you climbed a ladder into a burning building." Michael's voice carried the same mix of exasperation and concern that Susan's had whenever Robert did something she considered reckless. "And now I'm hearing from Aunt Jenny that the woman you saved is staying with you." "Aha." Robert sat down at his kitchen table, watching Margaret in the garden through the window. She was examining his struggling tomato plants with a critical eye, while Max lounged in a sunny spot nearby. "About that, do you remember me ever mentioning someone named Margaret Thompson?" The silence on the other end stretched for a moment. "Wait, that Margaret, your first love Margaret? The one who disappeared?" "She didn't disappear, she—" Robert paused, realizing this wasn't a conversation for the phone. "Why don't you come for dinner this weekend? Bring Sarah and the kids. You should meet her." In the garden, Margaret had produced a small notebook and appeared to be making notes about the tomatoes. Robert couldn't help but smile. Some things never changed. She'd always been the organized one. "Dad," Michael's voice softened, "are you sure about this? I mean, after Mom, your mother would want me to be happy," Robert said gently. "And right now I'm just helping an old friend who needs a place to stay. An old friend you risked your life to save. I would have done that for anyone." But even as he said it, Robert wondered if that was entirely true. A commotion on Michael's end of the line interrupted them. The sound of children arguing over breakfast, his daughter-in-law Sarah calling for peace. "Look, Dad, we'll come for dinner Saturday, and I'll try to keep an open mind." After hanging up, Robert joined Margaret in the garden. She looked up from her notebook with a guilty smile. "I hope you don't mind. Your tomatoes need calcium, and probably a better support system." "The tomatoes aren't the only ones," he replied, then filled her in on Michael's call. Margaret's face grew serious. "My daughter Claire called while you were in the shower. She's concerned, wants to drive down from the city today to assess the situation." "I guess we'll be having 2 uncomfortable conversations." 3, actually. Margaret pointed toward the house next door, where Tom and his wife Linda were not so subtly watching them over the fence. "The neighborhood welcome wagon is gathering." As if on cue, Linda waved and called out, "Robert! We're having a little neighborhood gathering this afternoon. Just coffee and cake. You and your guest should come." Robert and Margaret exchanged glances, both recognizing the barely concealed curiosity in Linda's voice. "Shall we face the Inquisition together?" he asked quietly. "Might as well get it over with." Margaret tucked her notebook into her pocket. "Besides, I remember Linda from high school. She was a gossip then too. Better to give her the real story than let her make one up." The day that followed felt like a gentle whirlwind. Claire arrived first, a poised young woman with her mother's eyes and a lawyer's careful way of asking questions. She sat at Robert's kitchen table, studying him as if he were an exhibit in court. "So you just happened to be there when the fire started." Her tone was skeptical, but not unkind. "Sometimes the best things in life aren't planned," Margaret answered before Robert could. "Like how I ended up in Seattle and met your father." Claire's expression softened slightly. "Dad always said you had a guardian angel looking out for you. I guess this time it wore a cardigan and reading glasses." The neighborhood gathering was next, a parade of familiar faces trying to hide their curiosity. Behind polite questions and knowing smiles, Robert and Margaret handled it with grace, sharing the simple version of their story, old friends reunited by chance, helping each other through a difficult time. "It's like something from a movie," Linda sighed dreamily, while her husband Tom recalled the ladder rescue with increasing embellishment each time he told it. By the time evening fell, both Robert and Margaret were exhausted from explaining themselves. They sat on Robert's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Claire likes you," Margaret said softly. "She can be protective, but she sees what I see." "And what's that?" "A good man. One who's cared enough to keep. A letter for 50 years, who grows struggling tomatoes because his late wife loved them, who rushes into fires to save old flames." Robert chuckled at the wordplay, then grew serious. "Michael's coming Saturday with his family. I'll make my grandmother's lasagna. It never fails to win people over. Susan used to say food was love made visible. She sounds like a wise woman." Margaret's hand found his on the porch railing. "I look forward to hearing more about her." Inside, they could hear Max moving around, his tags jingling as he settled in for the evening. The noise of the neighborhood gradually quieted, replaced by cricket song and distant wind chimes. "Quite a day," Robert mused. "Quite a life," Margaret corrected gently. Their fingers remained intertwined as the last light faded from the sky, and the first stars began to appear above Cedar Grove. Fire Marshal Jenkins arrived on a Tuesday morning, his official truck parking in front of Robert's house just as they were finishing breakfast. Through the kitchen window, they watched him approach, clipboard in hand, his weathered face serious. Beneath his department cap, "Mrs. Thompson," he called from the porch, "and Mr. Mitchell, I have some updates about the fire at the Cedars." They invited him in, Margaret pouring an extra cup of coffee, while Max studied the visitor with mild interest. Jenkins settled at the kitchen table, spreading out several photographs of the fire damage. "First, the good news," he began, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "The building's structure is largely intact. The sprinkler system contained most of the damage to the third floor, though there's significant water damage below." Margaret leaned forward, studying the photos. "And the cause? Faulty wiring in the walls, old building, outdated electrical system." Jenkins pointed to a particularly detailed photo. "The fire started inside the wall of your unit, Mrs. Thompson. If Mr. Mitchell hadn't acted when he did." He left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning hung heavy in the air. Robert felt Margaret's hand slip into his under the table. Such a small gesture, but it anchored him against the wave of what-ifs that suddenly threatened to overwhelm him. "The property manager is expediting repairs, but realistically, we're looking at 8 to 12 weeks before the building is habitable again." Jenkins shuffled his papers. "You'll need to make arrangements to retrieve any salvageable belongings. Within the next few days, we can provide an escort." After the fire marshal left, Robert and Margaret stood in the kitchen, the weight of near tragedy settling around them like fine dust. "I should go through what's left," Margaret said quietly. "See what survived." "I'll help," Robert offered immediately. "Some of those old chemistry skills might come in handy identifying what's safe to salvage." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "My whole life was in that apartment. Photos, letters, Claire's baby clothes, the box of memories. From 1973, in my bedroom closet. I don't know if we'll find out." Robert squeezed her hand. "Together." The next day found them standing in Margaret's fire-damaged apartment, wearing masks and gloves provided by the fire department. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of wet drywall. Margaret moved through, the space like a ghost, touching water-stained furniture, lifting soggy books. Robert followed quietly, carrying boxes for anything worth saving. In the bedroom closet, they found the memory box, smoke-damaged, but largely intact. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. "Look," she whispered, pulling out a stack of letters bound with a faded ribbon, "all the ones I never sent, and here." She produced a small velvet box. Inside was a class ring, Robert's from their senior year. "You kept it all this time?" "I meant to return it, but—" She smiled sadly. "I suppose we both held on to pieces of the past." They worked methodically through the apartment, salvaging what they could. Photo albums were carefully dried, jewelry, was cleaned, and a few pieces of furniture were deemed salvageable. Throughout the process, they discovered their old rhythm, working together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, sharing quiet moments of discovery. "Dad's pocket watch," Margaret exclaimed softly, finding the gold timepiece in a dresser drawer. "It still works. Like us," Robert said without thinking. When Margaret looked at him questioningly, he added, "A little smoky, maybe a bit worse. For wear, but still ticking." Her laugh, that wonderful bubbling sound, echoed through the damaged apartment, transforming it momentarily from a scene of loss to one of possibility. Back at Robert's house that evening, they spread their salvaged treasures across the living room floor. Max wandered through the collection, sniffing curiously at each item. "It's strange," Margaret mused, carefully wiping smoke residue from a silver picture frame. "Losing so much should feel more devastating, but somehow what? Somehow. It feels like making space, like clearing away the past to make room for whatever comes next." Robert looked at her, really looked at her, sitting cross-legged on his floor, her silver hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, her face touched by the same gentle determination he remembered from 50 years ago. "Whatever comes next," he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing away the last traces of smoke from the air. Inside, surrounded by rescued memories and newfound hope, Robert and Margaret continued their careful cataloguing of what was lost and what was found, each understanding that sometimes you have to lose everything to find exactly what you need. The first morning of their official cohabitation began with a small collision in the hallway. Robert, heading to the kitchen for his morning coffee, nearly collided with Margaret, already dressed and carrying a watering can. "Oh!" she exclaimed, stepping back. "I was just going to tend to those tomatoes. They really need morning water to maximize absorption before the heat of the day," Robert finished with her, smiling. "Some things you never forget from biology class. Mr. Peterson would be proud." She gestured toward the kitchen. "I made coffee. Real coffee, not that atomic strength brew you favor." The kitchen was transformed. The counters gleamed, the window plants were trimmed, and the morning light seemed to hit everything at just the right angle. On the table, 2 place settings waited, accompanied by fresh fruit and what appeared to be homemade muffins. "You didn't have to do all this," Robert said, but his tone was more appreciative than protesting. "Force of habit. David was hopeless in the kitchen, so I learned to be an early riser." She handed him a mug of coffee. "Besides, I like taking care of people, always have." Max padded into the kitchen, his morning routine disrupted but not unpleasantly so. He settled between them, clearly hoping the new household arrangement might mean extra breakfast treats. "You're supposed to be on a diet," Robert reminded the dog, who responded with a meaningful look at the muffins. "One little treat won't hurt." Margaret broke off a small piece of muffin. "Think of it as a peace offering for invading his territory." They settled into a comfortable breakfast rhythm, the morning paper shared between them. Margaret taking the crossword in pencil, Robert noted with amusement, while he read the local news. "The Cedars made the front page," he mentioned, showing her the article. "They're interviewing other residents about the electrical issues. Claire called last night after you went to bed. She's talking about a possible class action lawsuit." Margaret sighed. Always the lawyer. "She gets that protective streak from her mother." The comment slipped out naturally, but both of them paused, realizing the intimacy of such an observation. 50 years of separation, yet somehow they still knew each other's core traits. The day unfolded in a dance of adjustment. Margaret disappeared into the garden with her notebook and garden tools, emerging hours later with dirty hands and a satisfied smile. Robert found himself watching her from his study window as he attempted to organize his old teaching materials. By afternoon, the house had acquired a different energy. The spare room was now definitively Margaret's space, with her salvaged belongings arranged just so. The kitchen hosted new spices and cookware. Even the living room felt different, with the addition of her reading chair by the window. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she said when she caught him studying the changes. "I know this is temporary, but—" "It's nice," Robert interrupted. "The house hasn't felt this alive in years." Evening brought new rhythms to learn. They discovered they both preferred eating dinner early, sharing stories over Margaret's cooking. She told him about her life. In Seattle, her career as an art teacher, the joy of raising Claire. He spoke of his years with Susan, of teaching chemistry, of Michael's childhood adventures. "I used to wonder," Margaret said as they cleared the dishes together, "what kind of life you'd built. If you were happy." "I was," Robert replied honestly. "Different than what we'd planned at 17, but good." "Were you?" "Yes." She handed him a plate to dry. "Different but good. That's life, isn't it?" Max watched their domestic dance from his spot near the back door, head tilted as if trying to understand this new arrangement. When Margaret reached down to scratch his ears, he leaned into her touch like he'd known her forever. "Traitor," Robert said fondly. "He knows quality belly rubs when he finds them." Margaret knelt to give Max proper attention. "Don't you, sweet boy?" Later, as the evening wound down, they found themselves on the porch, a habit they'd somehow already formed. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of Margaret's newly pruned garden. "Claire wants to come for dinner tomorrow," Margaret mentioned. "She's bringing photos of the grandkids." "I'd like that." Robert hesitated, then added, "Michael and his family are still coming Saturday. Maybe they could meet, all of us together." The proposition hung in the air, weighted with possibility. This wasn't just about temporary arrangements anymore, and they both knew it. "I'd like that too," Margaret said softly. "Very much." Inside, Max barked once, his signal that it was time for his evening walk. They both stood, automatically reaching for the leash at the same time. Their hands met, lingered. Then Margaret smiled and handed it to Robert. "Go ahead. I'll make tea when you get back." Such a simple statement, yet it carried the comfort of routine, the promise of continuity. As Robert walked Max down their familiar route, he realized his house no longer felt like a museum of memories. Instead, it was becoming something new, a place where past and present merged, where temporary arrangements might just become permanent ones if they were brave enough to let them. The discovery of the yearbook was accidental. Margaret was arranging her salvaged books on the shelf Robert had cleared for her when the worn volume slipped from between two novels, landing with a soft thud at her feet. Cedar Grove High School. Glass of 1973, its gold lettering still visible despite the smoke damage. "Robert," she called, her voice carrying through the house. "Come look what I found." He appeared in the doorway moments later, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Is that—" "Our senior yearbook." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside her. "Care to take a walk down memory lane?" The bed dipped as Robert sat down, their shoulders touching lightly. Max, ever attentive, settled at their feet as Margaret opened the book. "Oh, Lord," Robert groaned, seeing his senior photo. "That haircut." "I love that haircut," Margaret protested, laughing. "Very. David Cassidy. You weren't the one who had to maintain it." His finger traced the caption beneath his photo. "Most likely to blow up the science lab. I never lived that down with my students." They turned pages slowly, each photograph triggering cascades of memories. The chemistry club photo showed them both, Robert in his lab coat, Margaret pretending to take notes on his experiment. "I only joined because of you," she admitted. "Science wasn't exactly my strong suit." "I know. You were drawing in your notebook instead of taking notes." He smiled. "I still have one of those drawings, you know. You gave it to me after the regional science fair, the one where my project on catalytic reactions won first place." Margaret's eyes widened. "You kept it? All this time?" Robert stood, walking to his study. He returned moments later with a folder, carefully removing a yellowed piece of paper. The sketch showed a young Robert in his lab coat, surrounded by beakers and flames, rendered in Margaret's distinctive artistic style. "My mad scientist," Margaret read the caption, her voice soft. "I remember drawing this. You were so passionate about the project, gesturing with your safety goggles pushed up on your head. You made me look heroic instead of nerdy. You were heroic to me." She touched the drawing gently. "Still are, running into burning buildings." They returned to the yearbook, finding more pieces of their shared past. The spring musical, where Margaret played Marion the librarian in The Music Man, while Robert worked the stage lights. The junior prom photo where they stood awkwardly in their finest. Margaret's white gloves gripping Robert's arm. "We were so young," Margaret mused, "so sure we had everything figured out." "We didn't figure out anything," Robert replied. "Life had other plans." Not all of them were bad plans. Margaret turned to the back of the yearbook, where signatures and messages filled the pages. "Look, there's Linda's note. You two are forever. Quite the prophet, our Linda. Just 50 years off in her timing." The words hung between them, full of meaning neither was quite ready to fully address. Instead, they continued through the yearbook, sharing memories and laughs until they reached Robert's message to Margaret, written in careful script on the last page. "To my future," Margaret read aloud, her voice catching slightly. "Thank you for making senior year the best of my life. Whatever comes next, know that you've changed me forever. Love always, Robert." "I meant it," he said quietly. "You did change me. Even after everything, you taught me about taking chances, about seeing beauty in unexpected places. You taught me too." Margaret closed the yearbook gently. "About patience, about doing the right thing even when it's hard, about waiting for the right moment." Max shifted at their feet, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room. "I never wrote in your yearbook," Margaret said suddenly. "I was going to, but then everything happened so fast, and I left." Robert stood, walking to his bookshelf. From behind several chemistry texts, he pulled out another copy of the same yearbook, more worn but less smoke-damaged. "It's not too late," he said, holding it out to her. 50 years overdue, but I'd still like to know what you would have written." Margaret took the yearbook, her hand steady despite the emotion in her eyes. She found a pen on the bedside table and opened to the back pages. For a moment she sat thinking, then began to write. Robert waited, watching her face as she composed. Her message. When she finished, she handed the book back without a word. "To my past, present, and perhaps my future," he read aloud. "Life took us on different paths, but somehow led us back to where we were always meant to be. Thank you for keeping your promise to always be the kind, brilliant, brave boy I fell in love with. He grew into an even better man. With love, still, Margaret." The room was quiet, except for Max's gentle breathing and the distant sound of wind in the garden. Robert closed the yearbook carefully, placing it beside Margaret's smoke-scented copy. "Better late than never?" she asked softly. "Much better," he agreed, taking her hand. They sat together. As the evening shadows lengthened, 2 copies of the same yearbook beside them. One that had travelled away and returned through fire, one that had waited patiently at home. Like their owners, the books had taken different paths, to end up side by side, their stories finally continuing together. The Cedar Grove Gazette wasn't known for sensational headlines, but this one caught everyone's attention. "Local hero's rescue leads to second chance at love." The article appeared on a Wednesday morning, complete with a photo of Robert and Margaret. Sitting on his porch, Max lounging at their feet. "Oh dear," Margaret said, spreading the paper on the kitchen table. "Linda's been talking to the press." Robert adjusted his glasses, reading aloud. "In a twist of fate that seems straight out of a romance novel, retired chemistry teacher Robert Mitchell didn't just save a woman from a burning building, he rescued his long-lost high school sweetheart." He groaned. "They make it sound like a Hallmark movie." "Keep reading," Margaret urged, fighting a smile. "It gets better." Neighbors report that the couple's reunion has brought new life to their quiet street. "It's like watching spring arrive in autumn," says local resident Linda Peterson. "They're proof that true love never dies. It just needs the right moment to bloom again." The phone started ringing before they finished breakfast. First was Sarah Chen, their young neighbor, offering to Organize a neighborhood welcome dinner for Margaret. Then came calls from Robert's former students, each with their own memories to share. "Mr. Mitchell!" exclaimed one particularly enthusiastic caller. "I was in your chemistry class in '92. You used to tell us that the right catalyst could change everything. Guess you were talking about more than just chemicals, huh?" By mid-morning, the front porch had accumulated 3 casseroles, 2 bundles of fresh flowers, and a hand-knitted throw blanket with a note that read, "To keep you warm while love blooms again." "The town hasn't changed much," Margaret observed, arranging the flowers in a vase. "Still can't resist a good love story. Or a good casserole," Robert added, examining the dishes, "though I suspect they're really just curious to see us together." As if on cue, a group of power-walking seniors happened to pass by, their pace slowing dramatically as they approached the house. Margaret and Robert waved from the porch, causing a flutter of excited waves in return. "We should probably get used to this," Robert sighed, but his eyes were twinkling. "Well, we could hide away," Margaret suggested, "or we could give them something to really talk about." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers just as the power walkers glanced back. The resulting buzz of conversation carried clearly across the morning air. Max, sensing the excitement, barked his own contribution to the neighborhood gossip. His afternoon walks with Robert and Margaret had become something of a local attraction, with neighbors finding creative reasons to be outside during their regular route. "Remember how it was back in high school?" Margaret asked as they prepared for their daily walk. "Everyone watching us, waiting to see what would happen." "Some things never change," Robert clipped Max's leash on, "though this time I think we're handling the attention better." Their walk took them past the library, where Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, hurried out to meet them. "Oh, I'm so glad I caught you. We're planning a community event, stories of Cedar Grove romance through the years. Would you consider being an exhibit?" Robert finished dryly. "Being an inspiration," Mrs. Henderson corrected, her eyes bright behind cat-eye glasses. "Sometimes people need reminding that it's never too late for joy." Margaret squeezed Robert's hand. "We'll think about it," she promised. Later that afternoon, as they sat in the garden reviewing the proof copy of the community newsletter, which, unsurprisingly, featured their story, Robert found himself less bothered by the attention than he'd expected. "You know what this reminds me of?" Margaret asked, looking up from the newsletter. "What?" "That time we won the science fair, the whole school watching us, everyone having an opinion about the chemistry club president and the art student working together." "As I recall," Robert said, "we proved them all right. The experiment was a success." "And this experiment?" Margaret gestured to the house, the garden, their intertwined lives. "What do you think the results will show?" Robert looked at her. Really, looked at her, surrounded by the flowers their neighbors had brought, Max dozing at her feet, her silver hair catching the autumn light. The years between them seemed to fold away like pages in a book, revealing something both old and new, familiar and exciting. "I think," he said slowly, "the initial results are very promising, though we might need to conduct further research." Margaret's laugh, that wonderful bubbling sound that had haunted his memories for 50 years, rang out across the garden. From next door they heard Linda's delighted gasp, undoubtedly adding this moment to her collection of observations. "Let them watch," Margaret said softly. "Let them see that some experiments are worth repeating, even after all this time." The afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, and somewhere down the street, a child's laughter floated on the breeze. Cedar Grove wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, its gossip and casseroles and well-wishes creating a cocoon of community support for whatever might come next. The garden bench arrived on a Saturday morning, delivered by Michael and his teenage son, James. It was a solid piece of craftsmanship, made of teak with a gentle curve that seemed to invite conversation. "Dad mentioned you like spending time out here," Michael explained to Margaret as they positioned the bench beneath the old maple tree. "Thought you might appreciate a proper seat." Margaret ran her hand along the smooth wood. "It's beautiful, Michael." "Thank you." Robert watched from the kitchen window as his son and Margaret discussed the perfect angle for the bench, something warming in his chest at their easy interaction. James, typically glued to his phone, was actually engaged in the conversation, showing Margaret how the bench's design was inspired by Japanese garden architecture. That evening, after Michael and James had left, Robert and Margaret sat together on their new bench. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Max lay at their feet, occasionally lifting his head to track the movement of evening birds. "Your son is very thoughtful," Margaret said, breaking their comfortable silence. "He gets that from his mother." Robert paused. "Susan would have liked you, you know." "Tell me about her." Margaret shifted slightly, making space for this important conversation. Robert took a deep breath, looking out at the garden they'd been tending together. "She was patient, kind. She knew about you, about us from the beginning. I told her everything before we got serious. She said that first loves shape us, make us who we are, and she was grateful to you for that. She..." "Sounds wise." "She was. Even at the end, she made sure everyone else was okay. Made me promise not to become a hermit." He chuckled softly. "I'm not sure this is what she had in mind, but I think she'd approve." "David was like that too," Margaret said. "Always thinking of others. When the cancer got bad, he worried more about Claire and me than himself." She reached for Robert's hand. "He told me it was okay to find happiness again." Their fingers intertwined naturally, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing over the past weeks. "Do you think," Robert asked carefully, "that we needed those years apart to become who we are now?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe. At 17 we were still becoming ourselves. We loved each other, but we hadn't grown into the people who could love each other right," Robert finished. "Exactly." She squeezed his hand. "Everything we've lived through, the joys, the sorrows, the families we built, it all led us here, to this bench, this moment." Max chose that moment to sit up, resting his chin on Margaret's knee. She scratched behind his ears with her free hand, smiling as he leaned into her. "Touch. You know what I don't regret," she said suddenly. "Not opening your letter back then, because now we get to read all our old letters together, understanding them with the wisdom we've gained." Speaking of letters, Robert reached into his cardigan pocket, pulling out an envelope. "I found this while organizing my study. I wrote it the day after the fire, but I wasn't sure when or if I should give it to you." Margaret took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. "Read it to me." Under the maple tree's spreading branches, Robert unfolded the letter and began to read. He spoke of fear and gratitude, of regret and hope, of the strange miracle that had brought them back together. As the words flowed, Margaret leaned against his shoulder, her presence warm and solid and real. "Perhaps," he read finally, "we needed 50 years to learn how to love not just with passion, but with patience. Not just with dreams, but with understanding. Not just with our hearts, but with our whole selves." When he finished, the garden was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves and Max's contented sighs. Margaret lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to Robert's knuckles. "We did learn, didn't we?" she whispered. "About love, about loss, about healing." "We're still learning," Robert replied, tucking the letter away. "Every day, with you teaches me something new." The autumn evening deepened around them, stars beginning to peek through the maple's branches. From their bench, their new favorite spot for sharing stories and silence, they watched the world settle into night, two people who had traveled long and separate roads to find their way home to each other. As if sensing the moment's importance, Max stood and stretched, then settled more firmly against their feet, a warm presence grounding them in the present, while their hearts bridged past and future. "What are you thinking?" Robert asked, noticing Margaret's contemplative smile. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that some benches are more than just benches. They're gathering places, for memories, for healing, for new beginnings." Robert nodded, understanding completely. This bench, like their rekindled love, was a gift, a place to rest, to share, to grow together. In the gentle darkness of their garden, surrounded by the life they were carefully building, healing didn't feel like an ending or a beginning, but a continuous journey they could finally share. Sunday dinner became the appointed time for their families to meet. Margaret spent the afternoon in the kitchen, the aroma of her grandmother's lasagna filling the house, while Robert nervously rearranged the dining room for the 5th time. The table won't set itself better no matter how many times you adjust it, Margaret called from the kitchen, somehow sensing his activity without seeing it. I just want everything to be perfect, he replied, straightening a fork that was already perfectly straight. Perfect is overrated, real is better. The doorbell rang at precisely 5 o'clock. Claire arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. She had her mother's eyes and determination, but her businesslike demeanor softened when Max greeted her with enthusiastic tail-wagging. He's usually more reserved with strangers, Robert observed. Dogs know good people, Margaret said, emerging from the kitchen to hug her daughter, just like their owners. Michael's family arrived moments later, his wife Sarah carrying a homemade apple pie, their children James and Emma trailing behind, the latter clutching a hand-drawn card for Grandpa's Margaret. The initial moments were awkward, everyone carefully navigating this new dynamic, but then Emma, with the unfiltered honesty of her 8 years, looked up at Margaret and announced, "You make Grandpa smile more than he used to." The tension broke. Claire laughed. Michael relaxed visibly, and Sarah immediately began asking Margaret about the lasagna recipe. James even put his phone away, drawn into a conversation about the garden bench he had helped deliver. "Dad used to talk about you sometimes," Michael said quietly to Margaret as they gathered around the table. "When he'd teach me chemistry, he'd say, 'I learned this technique from a girl who could make art out of science.'" Margaret's eyes met Robert's across the table. "He taught me that science could be beautiful," she replied, "even if I was terrible at balancing equations. Mom was the same with art," Claire added. "She'd say she learned to see beauty in unexpected places because of a boy who found poetry in chemical reactions." The lasagna was served, wine was poured, and grape juice for Emma, and conversation flowed more naturally. Stories were shared, embarrassing childhood moments, holiday disasters, proud achievements. Two families began weaving themselves together through laughter and shared meals. "Tell us about when you were young," Emma pleaded. "Before you got old and found each other again." "Emma," Sarah admonished, but Robert and Margaret just smiled. "Well," Robert began, "it started in chemistry class, when I was supposed to be taking notes, but was drawing instead," Margaret continued. They traded the story back and forth, their shared past coming alive for their children. The failed experiments, the secret meetings behind the equipment shed, the dreams they'd shared on summer nights. "But why did you separate?" James asked, genuinely curious now. "If you loved each other?" A heavy moment passed. Margaret reached for Robert's hand under the table. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "life takes unexpected turns, and sometimes it takes a lifetime to find your way back. Like in those movies Grandma Sarah likes," Emma declared, "but better because it's real." The adults exchanged glances, each remembering their own path through love and loss to this moment. After dessert, they gathered in the living room. Claire and Michael discovered they both practiced law, though in different fields. Sarah and Margaret bonded over their shared love of gardening. James actually volunteered to help Robert with some garden landscaping plans. Max moved from person to person, seemingly determined to make everyone feel welcome. He finally settled at Emma's feet, accepting her gentle petting with dignified pleasure. "This is nice," Claire said softly to her mother, "seeing you happy. Like this, Dad would have wanted this for you." Across the room, Michael was saying something similar to Robert, their voices low, but their smiles genuine. As the evening wound down, Emma's card found a place of honor on the refrigerator, and plans were made for future dinners. The families departed with hugs instead of handshakes. The awkwardness of earlier completely dissolved. Standing in the doorway, waving goodbye as cars pulled away, Robert and Margaret felt the weight of the evening. Not a burden, but a blessing. "Well," Margaret said, leaning against him, "that was perfectly real." "Better than perfect," Robert agreed, kissing her temple. They turned back into their home, their shared space now blessed by their family's acceptance. Max followed them to the garden bench, where they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening settle around them. Two families brought together by an unexpected twist of fate and a lifetime of waiting had become something new, something real, something perfectly imperfect. The real estate listings lay spread across the kitchen table, each one representing a possible future. Margaret had received the insurance check for her damaged apartment, and with it came decisions neither of them had expected to face so soon. "The Cedars will be ready in 2 weeks," Margaret said, stirring her morning coffee. "Karen called yesterday with the all clear." Robert looked up from his reading glasses, his heart doing an uncomfortable flutter. These past weeks had transformed his house into their home, so gradually, so naturally, that the thought of Margaret leaving created an almost physical ache. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I've been thinking about nothing else." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "The insurance money. It's enough for a down payment. I could buy something of my own." Max, sensing the tension, padded over and laid his head on Margaret's lap. She scratched behind his ears automatically, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "You could," Robert agreed carefully. "There's that nice townhouse on Maple Street." "Or," Margaret interrupted, "I could stay." The word hung between them, full of possibility. "Stay," Robert repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you want me to." Margaret's fingers tightened on his. "These past weeks being here with you, with Max, it's felt right. Like coming home after a very long journey." Robert stood, walking to the window where the morning sun illuminated their shared garden. The tomatoes were thriving now, thanks to Margaret's care. The garden bench sat in dappled shade, waiting for their evening conversations. "When Susan died," he said slowly, "I thought this house would always feel half empty. Then you came, and suddenly it was full again, not just with your presence, but with possibility." "But," Margaret prompted gently, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but I don't want you to stay just because it's convenient or because of the memories or—" "Robert Mitchell," Margaret's chair scraped back as she stood. "After 50 years, do you really think I'd make this decision lightly?" He turned to face her. She was holding one of the real estate listings, and as he watched, she deliberately tore it in half. "I don't need to look for a home," she said firmly. "I've found one. If you'll have me, if I'll have you." Robert laughed, the sound catching in his throat. "Margaret, I've had a room in my heart waiting for you for 50 years. She crossed the kitchen to stand before him. "Then ask me. Ask you. Ask me properly, like you should have 50 years ago, like I should have waited for." Understanding dawned in Robert's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he took her hands in his. "Margaret Thompson," he said softly, "will you make this your home? Will you plant gardens with me and solve crossword puzzles over coffee and sit with me on that bench until we're too old to climb up again? Will you help me make new memories to go with all the old ones?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "To all of it, yes." Max barked once, decisively, making them both laugh. The morning sun painted the kitchen in shades of gold, warming the space that had somehow become theirs, without either of them quite noticing when it happened. "We should tell the children," Margaret said, still holding his hands. "They'll say it's too soon. They'll say it's about time." Robert pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mingled with coffee and morning sunshine. 50 years too late, and right on time, all at once. "Time is funny that way," Margaret agreed. "Like chemistry. It's all about the right elements coming together at the right moment. Now who's the scientist?" "I had a good teacher. They stood in their kitchen. Officially their kitchen now, while Max wagged his tail and the torn reel. Estate listings scattered across the floor like confetti. Outside, a neighbor walked past, doing a barely subtle double-take at their embrace before hurrying off, undoubtedly to update Linda on the latest development. The gossip mill will be working overtime, Robert noted. Let them talk. Margaret's eyes twinkled. It'll give them something to discuss at the next community meeting. Speaking of which, Robert hesitated. Mrs. Henderson asked again about that romance through the year's event at the library. Maybe we should do it, Margaret suggested. Share our story. Show people that sometimes the long way around is the right way after all. Robert kissed her then, a gentle kiss that held 50 years of waiting, weeks of rediscovery, and a future, full of promise. Welcome home, he whispered against her lips. And in that moment, in their sun-filled kitchen with Max's tail thumping against the cabinet and torn real estate listings at their feet, both of them knew that sometimes the best decisions aren't decisions at all. They're simply recognition of what's already true. The Cedar Grove Library's community room was packed. Mrs. Henderson had vastly underestimated the interest in her Romance Through the Years event, particularly once word spread that Robert and Margaret would be sharing their story. I didn't expect quite so many people, Robert murmured, peeking through the door at the crowd. Familiar faces filled the seats. Former students, neighbors, even some of his old teaching colleagues. Cold feet? Margaret squeezed his hand. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her silver hair was elegantly styled. Claire's doing. Just wondering what Susan would think of all this. She'd tell you to stand up straight and project to the back of the room, Margaret smiled. Just like you used to tell your chemistry students. Before Robert could respond, Mrs. Henderson was at the microphone, introducing them. The applause as they walked to the front was surprisingly enthusiastic. So, Mrs. Henderson began. Once they were seated, tell us how this wonderful story began. Robert and Margaret exchanged glances, 50 years of history passing between them in a look. Well, Margaret started, it really began with a failed chemistry experiment. Their story unfolded naturally, each picking up where the other left off. The audience laughed at their teenage mishaps, sighed at their separation, and fell silent when they described their reunion during the fire. Did you know right away? Someone called out. When you saw each other again? Time changes many things, Robert answered, but some things remain constant. Like the laws of chemistry, certain elements will always react to each other, given the right conditions. The local newspaper reporter in the front row was scribbling frantically, and several phones were recording the event. By evening, their story had spread beyond Cedar Grove's boundaries. The next morning brought interview requests from regional news outlets. A popular blog about senior romance wanted to feature them. Even a television morning show expressed interest. We've gone viral, Margaret announced over breakfast, scrolling through her phone. Claire says we're trending on something called TikTok. Apparently we're relationship goals. Robert nearly choked on his coffee. We're what? There's a hashtag and everything. Chemistry never dies. They looked at each other and burst out, laughing, the absurdity of their situation finally hitting home. Max, used to their morning laughter by now, simply wagged his tail and continued hoping for toast crumbs. The attention brought unexpected consequences. Letters began arriving from all over the country, other seniors sharing their own reunion stories, young people asking for relationship advice, former students remembering Robert's chemistry lessons about reaction timing and optimal conditions. Listen to this one, Margaret said one evening on their bench. Your story gave me courage to contact my first love after 40 years. We're meeting for coffee next week. Thank you for showing us it's never too late. Robert wrapped an arm around her shoulders. We seem to have started something. A chain reaction, she teased, more like a catalyst for hope. The media interest eventually faded, but their impact on the community deepened. Mrs. Henderson reported a surge in attendance at senior social events. The local coffee shop introduced a second chance latte. Linda proudly told anyone who would Listen about her role in documenting their reunion. We've become a symbol, Margaret mused one morning, watching young couples slow down as they walked past their house, pointing at their garden bench. Does that bother you? No, she leaned against him. People need to believe in second chances, in the possibility of love returning, better and stronger than before. Like your lasagna, Robert said seriously. Better the second day. Margaret swatted his arm, but her eyes crinkled with laughter. You're lucky I love you, Robert Mitchell. Yes, he agreed simply. I am. The public interest had brought something unexpected, a deeper appreciation for their own story. Each time they shared it, they discovered new aspects, new moments of grace in their long journey back to each other. As autumn deepened toward winter, their story settled into Cedar Grove's collective memory, becoming part of the town's folklore. They were no longer just Robert and Margaret, but living proof that some loves are worth the wait, that life's timing, while mysterious, could be perfect in its own way. And if sometimes young couples stopped to take pictures of their garden bench, or if their mail occasionally included letters addressed to the chemistry of second chances, well, that was just part of their story now. A story still being written, one day at a time. The ring was still in its original box, tucked away in the back of Margaret's salvaged jewelry case. She found it while organizing their newly shared closet, the gold band tarnished but intact, the small diamond still catching light after 50 years. "Robert," she called, her voice wavering slightly, "could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, reading glasses perched on his nose. "What is it?" Margaret held out the box. "I thought I'd lost this in the fire." Robert's breath caught as he recognized it. The engagement ring he'd given her in 1973, just weeks before everything changed. He'd saved for months from his part-time job at the hardware store, chosen it with the confidence of youth and the uncertainty of first love. "You kept it," he said softly. "I couldn't bring myself to sell it, even after everything." She opened the box, the hinges creaking slightly. "It reminded me that love, real love, exists, even when it seems lost." Robert sat beside her on the bed, their shoulders touching. "We were so young, too young to understand what we were promising." Margaret traced the ring's outline with her finger, "but not too young to know what we felt was real. And now," Robert's voice was careful, measured, "now we're old enough to understand exactly what we're promising." She turned to face him fully. "Robert Mitchell, would you like to finish what we started 50 years ago?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with decades of living, loving, losing, and finding again. Max, sensing the moment's importance, padded over to lay his head on their knees. "Margaret Thompson," Robert said slowly, "are you proposing to me?" "Well, it is the 21st century," she smiled, "and we've never done anything quite the traditional way." Robert took the ring box from her hands, examining the small diamond that had once represented all his hopes and dreams. "It needs cleaning. Is that a yes?" "That's a let me do this properly this time." He stood, still holding the ring. "Wait here." He returned moments later with another box. This one newer, but still vintage. Inside was a ring she'd never seen, a simple gold band set with a deep blue sapphire. "I bought this for you," he said, sitting beside her again, "the day after the fire. I knew then, watching you sleep in that hospital bed, that if I got a second chance, I wouldn't waste it. Robert, 50 years ago I offered you a ring with more love than wisdom, more dreams than understanding." He opened both boxes, the old ring and the new sitting side by side. "Today I'm offering you both, the love we had then, made stronger by time and experience, and the love we have now, tempered by life and deepened by understanding." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she looked at the rings, symbols of their past and present, their journey coming full circle. "Will you marry me, Margaret? Not because of our history or convenience, or what anyone else thinks we should do, but because somehow, after all these years, we've found our way back to each other, better equipped to love each other than we ever were before." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it, past, present, and future. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he slipped both rings onto her finger, the old one first, then the new, the gold and diamond and sapphire catching the afternoon light streaming through their bedroom window. "Perfect fit," Margaret said softly. "Just like us, eventually." Max barked his approval, tail wagging as he sensed their joy. Outside, they could hear the usual sounds of their neighborhood, children playing, cars passing, birds singing in the maple tree. Life continuing as always, yet somehow completely different. "We should tell the children," Robert said, still holding her hand. "They'll say it's crazy. They'll say it's about time." Margaret leaned against him, their fingers intertwined, the rings cool against their skin. 50 years ago, we thought we knew everything about love. And now we know just enough to understand how much we still have to learn. She kissed him softly. "Together this time." The afternoon sun painted their room in shades of gold, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, marking time's passage. But in their room, surrounded by the life they were building together, time seemed to fold in on itself, past and present and future, merging into one perfect moment of completion. Linda Peterson's backyard had been transformed. Strings of white lights twinkled in the trees, tables dotted the lawn, dressed in autumn colors, and a hand-painted banner proclaimed, "Love is better the second time around." The entire neighborhood had conspired to throw an engagement celebration, despite Robert and Margaret's protests that they wanted something small. "Small is not what you deserve," Linda had insisted. "Besides, do you know how long I've waited to plan this party?" Now, as the evening light softened into dusk, Robert and Margaret stood together greeting their guests. Claire and Michael had worked together to coordinate family attendance, resulting in a gathering that spanned generations. "Grandpa, Grandma Margaret." Emma came running up, her party dress slightly grass-stained from playing with Max. "Look what I made." She held up a chemical formula written in wobbly handwriting. "Love plus time forever." "Very good," Robert praised, recognizing Michael's coaching in the scientific approach. "Though I think you forgot to balance the equation." "That's because love can't be measured," Emma declared with 8-year-old wisdom before running off to join the other children, chasing Max around the yard. Sarah Chen arrived with a special cake she'd commissioned, decorated with periodic table elements spelling out love in chemical symbols. James, usually so teen-reserved, had created a playlist that mixed songs from the 70s with contemporary romance classics. "Remember this one?" Margaret asked as Moon River began playing. "From behind the equipment shed?" "Our first dance," Robert nodded, taking her hand. "Shall we scandalize the neighbors again?" They moved together on Linda's makeshift dance floor, their steps slower but no less meaningful than they had been 50 years ago. Around them other couples joined in, Claire dancing with her husband, Michael spinning Sarah, even Linda and Tom swaying to the music. "Look at what we started," Margaret murmured, watching their blended families sharing the moment. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a leather-bound book. "We've been collecting messages," she explained, "stories from everyone about how your love story touched their lives." The book was filled with photographs, notes, and memories. Former students wrote about how Mr. Mitchell's chemistry lessons on patience and proper timing had taken on new meaning. Neighbors shared their observations of love, rekindled. Even the local paper had contributed their original article about the fire rescue. "This is too much," Margaret protested, but her eyes were bright with tears. "This is exactly enough," Claire corrected, joining them. "You two gave everyone here something precious, hope that it's never too late for love." As if to prove her point, an elderly couple they didn't recognize approached. "We read about you in the paper," the woman explained. "It gave us courage to reconnect after 40 years. We're getting married next spring." The celebration continued as stars began appearing above the trees. Children played with Max, who had somehow acquired a bow tie for the occasion. Teenagers set up a projector, displaying photos of Robert and Margaret, both from their youth and their recent months together. Hard to believe it all started with a fire, Michael mused, watching the slideshow. It started long before that, Robert corrected. The fire just reminded us that some flames never really go out. Margaret squeezed his hand, the old and new, rings catching the light from Linda's carefully strung decorations. Very poetic for a chemistry teacher. I learned from an art teacher that science and poetry aren't so different. He kissed her softly, earning a chorus of awes from their gathered guests. The evening wound down slowly, guests reluctant to leave the bubble of joy and possibility that seemed to envelop the gathering. Emma fell asleep on a garden chair, Max faithfully guarding her. James actually put down his phone, engaged in conversation with Claire about law school. As they prepared to leave, Linda pressed a package into their hands. "Open it later," she insisted, "when you're home." At their door, under the porch light, they unwrapped Linda's gift, a beautifully framed photograph, taken that evening. In it, they were dancing to Moon River, their faces caught in a moment of pure happiness, surrounded by the love of their combined families. "Perfect timing," Margaret said softly, touching the glass. "Always was," Robert replied. "We just had to wait for the right moment." They hung the photograph beside their wedding photos with Susan and David, not replacing the past, but adding to it, creating a visual timeline of lives fully lived and love never wasted. Max settled into his bed, bow tie slightly askew, as Robert and Margaret sat on their garden bench one last time that evening. Above them, stars winked like Linda's party lights, and somewhere in the distance, the last notes of another love song drifted on the night air. The wedding was held in their garden on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after the fire. The maple tree that had witnessed their reunion showered golden leaves like nature's confetti, and their garden bench, where so many important conversations had taken place, served as their altar. Robert stood waiting, his best man Michael at his side, as the small gathering of family and friends turned to watch Margaret walk down the petal-strewn path. Claire accompanied her mother, both women radiant with joy. Max, sporting a new bow tie, trotted alongside them as an unofficial escort. Margaret carried a bouquet of flowers grown in their garden, each bloom representing a piece of their story. Roses for love, forget-me-nots for memory, and late-blooming chrysanthemums for second chances. Around her neck hung a delicate gold chain holding 2 precious items, her original wedding ring from 1973 and David's wedding band. Robert wore Susan's wedding ring on a matching chain, the gold catching the morning light. Some memories, they had decided, should be honored rather than replaced. "Dearly beloved," began Mrs. Henderson, who had been delighted to get ordained for the occasion, "we are gathered here today to celebrate not just a marriage, but a testament to the endurance of love." The ceremony was simple but profound. They exchanged new rings, gold bands engraved with the right elements at the right time, and vows that acknowledged both their past and their future. "Margaret," Robert said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, 50 years ago I thought I knew what love was. Now I know it's something you learn every day, something that grows stronger with understanding and patience. I promise to spend whatever time we have left learning with you, growing with you, and thanking whatever twist of fate brought you back to me." Margaret's response came with her characteristic mix of humor and depth. "Robert, my first love, and my last love, who taught me that the best reactions take time to develop fully. I promise to continue our experiment in love and life, to face whatever challenges come our way, and to never again let time or fear keep us apart." Emma, taking her role as flower girl very seriously, presented them with their rings on a small, velvet cushion. James, filming everything on his phone, captured the moment their hands trembled slightly as they exchanged the bands. "By the power vested in me," Mrs. Henderson concluded, "and with the joyful blessing of this community, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again and finally, their kiss was gentle, seasoned with memories and promises. While they gathered, loved ones applauded and Max barked his approval. The celebration that followed was exactly what they wanted: intimate, joyful, and full of meaning. Tables were set up around their garden bench, laden with food prepared by both families. Claire and Michael gave a joint toast that left few dry eyes in the gathering. "To our parents," Claire raised her glass, "who taught us that love stories don't always follow a straight path. And to second chances," Michael added, "that turn out to be better than first ones." As afternoon mellowed toward evening, Robert and Margaret found a quiet moment together on their bench. Above them, the maple tree's remaining leaves danced in the autumn breeze. "Happy?" Robert asked, though he knew the answer. "Complete," Margaret replied, leaning her head on his shoulder, "though I do have one question." "Oh? What took us so long?" Robert chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "We needed all that time to become the people who could love each other properly, to learn from other loves, to grow through loss, to understand what really matters." "Very wise, Professor Mitchell. I learned from the best, Mrs. Mitchell." Around them, their garden bloomed with late autumn flowers, plants they had tended together, symbolic of their renewed love. Their families mingled easily now, sharing stories and laughter. Max dozed nearby, worn out from the excitement but unwilling to leave their side. As the light faded, Linda and Tom set up the surprise they'd planned, dozens of paper lanterns that transformed the garden into a magical space. The warm glow illuminated the faces of their loved ones, each one a part of their extended story. "Look," Margaret whispered, pointing to where Emma was teaching James a dance step. Claire was deep in conversation with Sarah about law practice, and Michael was showing Linda photos on his phone. "Our families really have become one. Just like us," Robert agreed. They sat together on their bench, surrounded by the life they had built and the love they had reclaimed. The evening air carried the scent of autumn leaves and new beginnings, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not an ending, but a beginning. Margaret touched the rings at her throat, then the new one on her finger. "Some things are worth waiting for. Some things are worth everything," Robert replied, and kissed her again, there on their bench under the maple tree, while their family celebrated around them, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Max stretched and moved closer, resting his head on their feet, completing their circle of contentment. Together they sat, watching their joined families, their shared future stretching before them like a path through their garden, not a straight line, but a beautiful journey, made perfect by its imperfections and precious by its timing. The right elements had finally come together at the right time, creating a reaction more powerful and lasting than either of them had imagined possible 50 years ago. And in that moment, as night settled gently around their celebration, both Robert and Margaret knew that sometimes the best experiments are the ones that take a lifetime to perfect.